Our first speaker is Eilidh from the British Institute on Human Rights, and she is going to be talking to us on child rights impact assessments. So Eilidh, if I can perhaps just hand over to you now.
Yes, perfect, thank you. Hello everyone, my name is Eilidh and I'm from the British Institute of Human Rights. I'm a human rights officer there. And I'm going to do a really quick 10-minute sort of introduction to rights impact assessment. So at BIHR, we're not sort of strictly a children's rights charity. We work on human rights and the Human Rights Act, but lots of stuff that I tell you today is sort of directly applicable when you're working specifically with children and young people. So it's just a tiny little bit about BIHR. So you know why I'm here and why I'm speaking about this. So we are a human rights charity. We work all across the UK and we focus on the Human Rights Act. And we work firstly with people who access services, which is every one of us at different points in their life. And we provide people with information so they can use human rights law to change their own lives. We work with community groups, other charities, organisations, self-advocacy groups, all stuff like that. To help them to use social justice, to use human rights advocacy to address social justice issues. And we also work with systems, and by systems we mean public services and the people that work with them and within them. And we work with them to increase the accountability of public bodies to respect and protect human rights in everything they do every day. So imagine human rights impact assessments, they come up in all of these parts. So public bodies, they have the duty to be thinking about respecting and protecting human rights. So we support them to do human rights impact assessments based for their decisions, where that's a sort of individual decision that might impact one person, or a wider decision around sort of creation of policy or whatever that might be. And we also, all that work feeds into our policy work. And in our policy work, we amplify the stories of people whose rights might be at risk to help change policy that affects them and their families so that those voices are heard in the places where decisions can be made. And in order to do that, of course, we do our own human rights impact assessments. If there's maybe a change to policy or a change to law, and we say these are the rights that could be impacted, and this is what the people who may be impacted sort of say about that, it's how it's going to affect them. Okay. So today, really quickly, going to have a look at what are rights impact assessments and sort of some of the specificities we need to think about in terms of children and young people, why we should do them, and how do you do them. So firstly, what are rights impact assessments? What are children's rights impact assessments? So they sound big and complicated and scary, but essentially, it's a tool used to look at the potential impact on rights of a change to policy, law, practice, or a decision. And of course, children's rights impact assessments is looking at how it's impacting children's rights. And that could be both a positive impact and also a negative impact. So they can and should be done when any decision is being made either by a government or a public body. So just now, across the UK, the Human Rights Act says that whenever public bodies are making a decision, it should be compatible with the rights in the Human Rights Act. And of course, in Scotland, we're going to have the UNCRC bill, incorporation bill, where now public bodies have to act compatibly with UNCRC requirements. So they have to be thinking about any decision, is this compatible with the UNCRC requirements? So that's sort of duty on public bodies. But in terms of charities, groups and organisations, we can use these to raise concerns and prompt decision makers to relook at decisions, taking human rights into account. So why should we do them? So of course, it's the duty of public services and the people that work within them. But in terms of why we might want to do independent ones for charities and organisations and so on, firstly, it reminds decision makers of their human rights duties and sort of draws attention to them. From sort of own personal experience, the Human Rights Act is 20 years old, and sometimes in the discussions that I'm having with people working in public services, it's maybe the first time that they've learned about these duties. And that's sort of the fault of no one, but sometimes we have to take a step back and remember that the sort of applicable law, it's really important to bring that into discussion. We can recenter rights in decision and policy making. And really importantly, when we're thinking about sort of the real life impact of this, we can preempt the impact on children's rights, which means that steps can be taken to mitigate, reduce, and preferably avoid any negative impact on rights. And I guess on the other side of the coin, sort of raise up good positive steps that are in decisions that are going to be a positive impact on rights as well. As charities, groups and organisations, of course, we can provide expertise, experience and nuance. Perhaps there's going to be a decision, maybe a policy or a change to practice that might impact a certain group of people, group of young people, and that might not be sort of most obvious, but because we work with that group of young people, because we work with them every day, because we know their experiences, because we're talking with them, we can raise that up and make that sort of known to people that are making decisions. We can make sure the voices and experiences of the people that are potentially impacted are centred. So what we are doing essentially is looking at law, looking at policy, looking at decisions and sort of showing the real life impact. So how do you do them? Really excitingly, actually, BIHR, we are currently working together to develop a tool that can be used to support charities, groups and organisations to do children's rights impact assessments. So at BIHR, as I've been saying, for the past 20 years since the passing of the Human Rights Act, we've been supporting public services and charities to do human rights impact assessments. So we will take our expertise and we'll combine it with the children's rights expertise of Together and their members to create a useful tool for doing children's rights impact assessments. And that's something that both of us will be in touch with in the future. But what must they do? Okay, so as I said, I know it sounds something that can sound a bit scary. It sounds quite legal, but it's essentially a 3-step process. Firstly, we have to think about what human rights apply. Okay, so Human Rights Act applies, of course, to everybody across the UK, regardless of age. And sort of in the next few months, we'll have the UNCRC incorporation bill, and then there'll be legal duties around acting compatibly with that for public services. So first of all, what laws apply? Find that out, work that out, and sort of state that. Second, what rights will be impacted? So looking at those rights, looking at the rights within them and thinking specifically, okay, this is the law, this is the policy, this is the change. These are the potential rights which might be impacted, and setting that out. And then thirdly, including any steps that can be taken to ensure that this decision, law or policy is more rights respecting. So all of you on this call, you're all, of course, you're the experts, in the sort of areas that you're working in. So you'll be able to have some points, some ideas around how steps that can be taken to make sure it's more rights respecting. So how can we do that? How can we do that in practice? So at BIHR, we use 2 tools. First is panel, and I'm sure that lots of you will be aware of panel. That's a sort of general approach to having a human rights approach. That was sort of initially developed by the UN. It's been used a lot by the Scottish Human Rights Commission. That's probably where you've seen it. And also FAIR, the FAIR model, which was also sort of developed by the Scottish Human Rights Commission, but something that we use every day with public services, people that work in public services, with charities, with groups that support different groups of people. So I'm just going to really quickly go through these 2 tools, and you'll see that there's lots of stuff that you can directly take for children's rights impact assessments, but there might also be some things that you think could be missing or could be thought about, and that's that question that we'll look at in the breakout room. Okay, so panel, again, I'm sure to a lot of you, this is not new. So panel's participation, people and groups should be involved in the decisions that impact or affect their rights. And obviously here we'd be looking at, have children and young people that could potentially be impacted? Have they been able to have a say? Have they been supported to have a say? A stands for accountability. People and groups should be listened to, and there should be changes made if something's gone wrong. There should be clear ways to raise an issue. N stands for non-discrimination. People and groups should be offered equal opportunities to be involved and share their views. And of course, different people and groups will need to be supported in different ways to be able to do that. And really importantly is empowerment. Everyone should know about their rights and feel fully supported in being involved in decisions and discussions that are about their lives and impact their rights. And then legality, decisions and processes should be based on human rights law. So Human Rights Act or UNCRC, for example. So that's the sort of general human rights approach, which I'm sure is not new to a lot of you, but something that's another really sort of useful day-to-day thing that we can use is the FAIR model. And actually we use this every day. From decisions that impact one person to maybe a decision of an internal policy. So say the visiting sort of policy of a mental health hospital, for example, and we would go through this and we would ask them to think, we would ask the decision makers to think about each step of FAIR. And we can see whenever we're doing this, we're taking into account the rights, we're taking into account the law, and we're also sort of identifying what needs to be done in the future. And this is also how we do our own sort of human rights impact assessments. So for example, whenever the coronavirus bill was being passed at the start of coronavirus, we used this model and we created a briefing and we sent that to MPs and Lords. So the FAIR model, first is facts, establish the facts. What is the situation? How long has it been going on for? What is the impact on the people that are involved? And of course, involve the person, their families, maybe sort of groups that can speak for these people that share and amplify the views and opinions of them. So of course, in a children's rights impact assessment situation, that'd be for children and young people. Analysis of the rights at stake. So after you've done your fact-finding mission and you've found out how long has it been going on for, what could the potential impact be, we would look at our laws and see what are the rights that could be impacted. And after that, we would say, okay, these are the potential human rights impacts. In order for this to be more sort of rights respecting, these would be the changes that would be necessary. This would be what needs to happen to make this decision, whether it's a new law, whether it's a policy, whether it's a practice, or whether it's even a sort of individual decision. And then, of course, there's always a need to record and review. And also to sort of support that and happen in sort of all sorts of different levels. So a decision which might not be a massive impact on rights this week or next week could be so in a few months' time. So there's that need to review and say, come back to things and think, okay, is it still the most rights respecting decision, policy, whatever it might be. Of course, we've all seen over the past year in the pandemic, none of us could have really seen the massive impact that was going to have on the lives of us all. So things can change. So there's that need to continue to record and review. So that's what we use as our sort of model to do human rights impact assessments. Really 4 simple basic steps, which mean that we can look at how the human rights, children's rights of the people impacted could be affected, and crucially identify some changes which could be necessary. Okay, so the last thing I want to say just before I open up for questions, I've maybe even went a bit faster than 10 minutes, is firstly, don't be afraid to do child impact assessments. Remember, whenever we are either doing them as a public service or an organisation, or if we're doing an independent one as a charity or organisation, speaking for a group of people, we're talking about the law, we're talking about legal frameworks and asking them to be respected and be fought about. But of course, in order to do that, there's a need to upskill yourself on human rights laws. Law can be confusing, can be complicated, it can be very difficult to sort of understand and digest, but there's hundreds of resources out there on both the Human Rights Act, which we focus on, and I'll actually send some stuff around after that, and on the UNCRC. There's going to be lots and lots of stuff about that. So there's lots of work being done to make the human rights, the law, which we're asking people to apply or we are applying ourselves, there's lots of work being done to make that accessible as possible. Crucially, in thinking about those panel sort of principles, centre the voices and experiences of children and young people. And remember, lots of you here are the experts of doing that. This is the stuff that you've been doing for years and years. Keep it simple. Think about your audience and keep it simple. So think about who you're writing to. Think about the fact that people might be very busy and they have a lot on their plate, as we all do. So really setting out saying, this is the law. These are the rights that could be impacted. These are some simple steps, or these are some sort of doable steps that we say that could be taken to make sure it's more human rights compliant. And not, I guess, presuming that there's massive amounts of background knowledge and any of that stuff. Keep it really simple for both yourself and for the audience that you're writing to.
I want to introduce you to our human rights budgeting group and its development as a concept in Scotland. These slides have been made available in the resource pack, and there's also some further sources of information at the end of this presentation. And we also put together a short written piece. So what we're starting from an argument here that the budget is arguably the most significant instrument of social policy because it can be used to constrain, maintain, or enable progressive reform at the local and at the national level. And as the human rights scholar Ailidh Turnbull said, budgets are a key sign of a government's values. So if human rights are not in there, what's being said is that they are not a value worth counting. So human rights budgeting aims to enable the realization of everyone's human rights by applying the international human rights standards to budgeting, which then would increase transparency of decision-making, participation, and importantly, embedding accountability and therefore legitimacy into decision-making. Our group was founded in 2017 with a small EU grant, and we've built a range of evidence and briefing papers to advance the use of human rights budgeting. It's a really brilliant collaboration. I get a lot of energy from the people that I'm working with here. It's mutually empowering, and we each contribute more to understand the power of human rights budgeting. So there's a strong focus on capacity building within the team, and of course that's what we're here to talk about today. How do we scale that up to everyone that needs to know about it across Scotland? I'd just like to, before we move to the next slide, champion Kirsty English, who's a University of Glasgow Q-STEP intern, delivered new evidence aligning to the Open Budget Survey. She's now a PhD student. She's brilliant. And so her data scrutinises the openness of 117 countries and was applied to the Scottish budget in 2017-18. So we do have a benchmark to measure progress against. And Aidan Flegg, who's co-presenting here with me today, a PhD student at the University of Glasgow, and he supervised in partnership with Dr. Katie Boyle at the University of Stirling and in collaboration with the Scottish Human Rights Commission. So there's a lot of different projects and things that are coming together here. I pass over to you, Aidan, and slide 2.
Sure, thanks, Jo. So kind of bringing it back to where this started and the conversations around incorporation. I think most people will be aware of the agenda now from the National Task Force on Human Rights Leadership Report and the recommendations that we should be incorporating these international treaties in Scotland. Now, incorporation of international human rights treaties can be achieved in different ways, and there's lots of examples around the world of how this happens, but really what it means in basic terms is providing recognition of the treaty's rights and their obligations within Scotland's domestic framework. Today we're really going to be focusing on the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, as well as the UNCRC. So these two really bring into focus this human rights budgeting angle. It's a really exciting prospect for Scotland. It has the potential to impact public bodies significantly and really provides an opportunity for Scotland to become a world leader in respecting, protecting and fulfilling children's rights. So it's, as the Scottish Human Rights Commission would say, it's a new era for human rights in Scotland and a huge positive. Now, I know that we've already discussed how legal some of this is, so I really apologize for the next slides, but I think it's really important to kind of grasp some of these top level obligations that come from the international treaties. And the reason is because they form such a core element of how we conduct human rights budgeting. So looking at this is Article 2.1 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. And the important aspects of this text here on the slide is this idea of using maximum of its available resources and achieving progressively the full realization of the covenant. So we break down this idea of what we call progressive realization into 3 sub-duties, if you like. So we want to use the maximum available resources to us. That can talk to the overall kind of size of the pie, if we like to use that pie analogy when we're thinking out budget. And examples can be from local finances in terms of house tax and other such, and it can also go fully up to kind of macroeconomic policy of how we increase Scotland's resources. Next, we're really looking at non-retrogression. Now, non-retrogression is quite a difficult one, but really what it's asking us to do is not take backward steps. So once a policy has been achieved and the budgetary commitment has been made, we don't want to then take backward steps for that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, cutting a budget would automatically be regressive. What we're saying is if that policy and the budgetary money there is key to meeting human rights obligations, a cut would be regressive. So not everything will be regressive. An example recently is the cuts to universal credit. Many human rights scholars would example that as regressive steps for rights. Okay. Now, finally, we have this concept of minimum core obligations. Now, this is quite a tricky kind of normative concept. It throws up all kinds of horrible philosophical entanglements, but really what it's trying to speak to is that everyone should enjoy a very basic level of each of these rights, a kind of morality of the depths, if you like, a basic standard of living. Some people like to think about it as a social minimum from that kind of line of thinking. Now, having run through those incredibly quickly, so I apologize for that, how does all this apply to children and the UNCRC? So I've been talking about the ICESCA, that Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. Now, this applies to children because, as we can see from Article 4, it echoes that same language. So we're still talking about this idea of maximizing our resources. So to the maximum extent of the available resources, states should be realizing children's rights. Now, this was a really unexplored area of rights implementation for children for a long time. But actually in 2016, the UN committee in charge of providing guidance to countries on how to implement the UNCRC really gave this explicit guidance to say, no, this is connecting to budgets. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see General Comment 19, Children's Rights and Public Budgets, and a few excerpts from there just highlighting how government budgets are connected. Okay, now, why do we need both? And it's because children's rights really differ from economic social rights in general. So often children can be in a more vulnerable situation and therefore are more likely to be violated. So really we need this explicit understanding that we want the obligations from the International Covenant of Economic, Social, Cultural Rights to also apply to the UNCRC. That's a lot of the international framework, but I think it really helps in embedding how we move forward with looking at budget. I think a really important last aspect to kind of talk about here is, along with child's rights impact assessments, indicators, benchmarks, human rights budgeting is really a measurement tool. It's a monitoring tool for looking at whether we are moving in the right direction with realizing rights, and that's what underpins all of this work. Finally, before I hand back to Joe to kind of look at more some of the practical implications of this, we wanted to just make people aware that there are other techniques and other frameworks at use in Scotland right now. There was a brilliant report out earlier in the year around wellbeing economics and children's rights, and we have also been looking into these frameworks. So wellbeing budgeting, gender budgeting, participatory budgeting. These are all mutually reinforcing frameworks that we can use to realize human rights. Now, the reason we have focused on human rights is because of that basis in legal terms and the fact that we can really use that to meet these kind of international legal obligations. So it's kind of the base to build from. but actually each framework has a lot to learn from one another. I'm going to pass back on to Joe now. I think is still on mute.
I'm here. Sorry, I muted myself in case there was noise. Terrible. Yeah, thanks. Do you know, I'm gonna talk very quickly to this slide because I know you've seen something on the panel principles already. All I'd really like to say is that for participation, we really need power sharing from those who are making policy, who hold the purse strings. Participation isn't just about getting, you know, people with lived experience into the room. It's about getting policymakers into the room and making the decision in the room instead of listening and then making the decision elsewhere. I know we're short for time. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah, so what I wanted to do is kind of bring this down to children again. So I want to make the point that if we only use a human rights-based approach, actually, we're going to lose some of the power that come from these other approaches. So I know we've got some policymakers in the room, and what we want to be presenting is how do we create the best possible model that incorporates the best parts of all of these so that we can really achieve human rights for Scotland's children. So a really strong contribution comes from children's budgeting, which in turn is hugely influenced by wellbeing economics. And here, progressively improving services and budgeting and access to influence are championed, but the headline is around prevention. And this is consistent with a human rights-based approach, in so much as preventing human rights abuses delivers human rights realization. Nevertheless, the call for prevention places an urgency on policymakers and budget holders and a clear mandate to focus on early years reform. That is the ideal area to start our human rights budgeting work. The argument around prevention human rights abuses, has been prevalent in social policy literature for a long time, decades and decades. But public services have, through that period, been in crisis mode, forced to spend extreme sums of money and leaving little budget to forward plan towards prevention. So we can use this idea of maximum available resources, and we can understand as a country how we access money and stop budgeting year and year and thinking about a 10-year or a 20-year program where the wealth we have over that period, how could we invest that differently to move from crisis mode? And I appreciate I'm skimming over a lot of established fields of research of social policy inquiry here, but we need to draw these things together very practically. And from gender budgeting too, about paying adequately for the care that our children should be receiving to realise rights. And if we're properly investing in care, in carers, we're investing in early years intervention, it will save us money in the long run. We know that. But also it's going to immediately boost our economies, which is so important after austerity and COVID. And so investment in early years intervention is a prime way of investing in early years. It'll increase the income, particularly of women, and particularly of women living with multiple barriers to being and doing, who are facing economic hardship, social and cultural rights violations. These women spend locally because their sources of employment care is local, and this boosts local economies, which is an excellent thing to do in communities challenged by austerity, Brexit, and the pandemic. So human rights budgeting, bringing in gender budgeting, children's budgeting, well-being economies, provides a whole load of economic solutions with young people at the centre. And here my graphics could be better, but instead of seeing this as a circular motion, it's an upward spiral where we increasingly are able to spend more on prevention because we have more money coming through our local economies. Because if we're paying carers, we're getting tax from carers too. So the final slide is just about closing the presentation. And I'm sorry we've gone through such a lot and so quickly, but we had the opportunity to shout at you and we've taken it. There's more work available and our work is ongoing. So if there's anything that we can do to take this conversation further, we'd be delighted to do it. Aidan, did you have a closing point?
Thanks, Joe. I think we're very short on time, but I think the main aspect to take away from human rights budgeting is it is quite a daunting task, marrying these concepts of fiscal policy to these quite international obligations. But actually, when you start breaking it down, you can really begin to see how applying this approach will make a huge difference to how decisions are made throughout Scotland. So I really couldn't encourage people to engage with the concept of human rights budgeting within the organisation.
I must confess that trying to fit it all in 10 minutes has been a little bit like a mission impossible. So, and that's because there is a plethora of tools, measures, and indicators supporting data collection and analysis regarding children, young people, and their rights. And I would like to stress how important it is to look carefully at the rationales that underpin their development, to truly understand what each tool or indicator can or cannot offer. And if we look across these tools and indicators, we see various expectations and aims, such as measuring performance, compliance with treaty obligations, comparing between states and measuring progress over time, projecting neutrality, avoiding the weight put in some anecdotal evidence, and this is the case usually with audit-like tools, and informing improvement, guiding research and evidence-based opinion, and last but not least, informing and strengthening advocacy. I'll invite you to look at some examples and consider the scope and what they can and cannot offer. The first one is the End of Childhood Index developed by Save the Children. It's a comparison across 186 countries on data on factors that drop children off their childhood, such as malnutrition, being out of school, forced into adult roles through labor, marriage, or motherhood, and so on. And what we see is that this index groups countries into 5 categories. At the top tier, we see countries that where few children are missing out on childhood. So this is where children are most protected. At the bottom categories, those countries where nearly all children are missing out on childhood. And if we look at the latest available data for this year, for example, we see that UK is ranked 28 and is placed in the top category. Although it's not in the top 10, it's still in the top category. And it's interesting that no countries were placed in the bottom category. So looking at this data, the question that came up for me was how accurate these data are. And I looked at the definition of terms. For example, if I can find the differences between formal and informal marriages. And then I started to think about the sources of data. And of course, in this case, we are talking about national statistics. So my question went to what happens to those hidden children, the children who don't show up in the statistics. So therefore, how accurate the comparison can be between countries. And then, okay, what can I understand in the absence of context? More about the cultural context and so on. So I think this is one of those limitations when we look at a huge number of countries, because we are lacking the contextual information, and also one of those limitations when we look only at quantitative data without looking at more in depth at what it means. So what are the qualitative data that tells us about the context? And for example, Porter in 1995 in his book Trust in Numbers referred to quantification as a technology of distance, it's first of all a strategy of communication. that minimizes the need for in-depth knowledge of local context. And our understanding of what quantification communicates is, and I quote, poor indeed if we do not relate it to the forms of community in which it flourishes. I like Porter's reminder about data as a way of communication, and the next example can illustrate that. It's a tool that led to titles such as UK among the least family-friendly country, or if you were across the pond, you'll see Sweden and Norway were found to offer best family-friendly policies. And this is UNICEF family-friendly policy tool that is actually a league table across 41 high and middle-income countries, and that presents data on the duration of the parental leave, but also the percentage of children enrolled in formal childcare services or preschool education. Looking at this tool, I think one of the things that jumps out for me is the relevance of some of the indicators here. For example, is enrollment really the most relevant indicator? What about the quality and type of care? What about the provisions, such as the numbers or hours per week? If we think about it is indeed, and I like it that it's focused on a theme, but are the indicators selected really showing us the vast array of what family-friendly policies mean? What about paid leave for care for sick young children? What about flexible working hours for parents, or indeed support for and guidance for parents, such as help visiting? Nevertheless, what I like about this tool is that it links policy to what we expect to see, or it invites us, it aims to link policy to what we expect to see at the level of children and families. And it also opens avenues for further qualitative work, and the report that comes with it is very good at actually highlighting some of those knowledge gaps. So it's more than just a league table. It also invites us to do our further, let's say, work. Very quickly, that you'll be able to find child-specific indicators in broader initiatives such as the Sustainable Development Goals Index and Dashboard. Some of the indicators there refer to children. The same with the Human Development Index, and I use that quite a lot in some of my previous roles, particularly around advocacy and being able to see or to see where the red flags can be, and continue doing some work around that. And I realized that by now I didn't actually mention children's rights indicators. And the thing is that there is no single definition or approach on what children's right indicator is or expected to show. We see various approaches, some that fit quite nicely in the, let's say, classic pattern, the one that we discussed and we saw in the previous slides. So mainly socioeconomic indicators, and an example could be Kids' Rights Index, which is an international tool, and it's again a scorecard across 192 countries. It uses 13 quantitative indicators that draws data from UNICEF and UNDP, and it also brings 7 indicators based on the assessment of the tone and the information in the concluding observation of the Committee on the Right, issued by the Committee on the Rights of the Child. So I like this novelty. I like the fact that they try to think about the qualitative aspects. However, here there is and we know that there is going to be a time lag. The qualitative data will nevertheless be quantitative because it is transformed into scores, and then it refers to sometimes 4 or 5 years previous to the moment of the analysis, whilst the quantitative data is actually annual. Another example is something that happened at national level, and is the Belgian National Child Rights Indicators. So they acted on one of the recommendations of the UN Committee to further develop the children's data on children's rights. So they tried to develop this, and they drafted 40 quantitative indicators. Again, based on existing data, and on a meeting of set of standards for quality. This was met and like the committee welcomed the establishment of this set of indicators. However, criticized the lack of information that is disaggregated to show non-discrimination, or to actually look further into non-discrimination, and also criticized the coverage, saying it's still too narrow. It should be broader than that. And another approach that I would like to talk to you about is the one that follows structure, process, and outcomes pattern. And this is derived from human rights standards. And basically, in this pattern, a human rights indicator can be understood as having a twofold aim of measuring, on one hand, stand compliance with treaty obligations. So these are the structures and the processes. And then on the other hand, the extent to which the individuals are actually enjoying the rights. So we are talking about the outcomes. And if you remember about that family policies that I mentioned earlier, it was an attempt in this direction. And an example here could be the early childhood index, actually set of indicators that operationalizes the general comment number 5 on early childhood. And it goes into these 3 type of indicators: the structures, so the commitment to action, and the process, the efforts made after the commitment is made. So if you think about it, it's almost like we have the car, we have the chassis of the car, but then the process is what makes the car going, is the motor, is the fuel, and then of course the outcomes is what happens at the level of children. I have more information in the slides and in the notes. I will share them, and I'm sorry for rushing through this, but I also wanted to talk actually very little about the EU agencies for fundamental rights set of indicators that look at the protection and respect and promotion of the rights of the child in the EU. These are very contextual. They are actually looking at the policy existing at EU level. And they cover 4 areas: family, environment, protection from exploitation, education, citizenship, and cultural activities, and adequate standard of living. I think I was part of the initial process of developing this set of indicators, and I know how much work it went into it. But then if we think about it, at the end of the day, it's quite time bound, because it looked at the policies that existed at that moment when the set of indicators developed. But we know that the goalpost moves, and now we have new policies in EU, and therefore the set of indicators will always need to be kept up to date with the new settings. Looking ahead, I really liked model that Professor Laura Lundy suggested. It's still based on structure, process, and outcomes, but it brings a few elements. So this is a model that is at this moment just theoretical. So we don't know how it would work in practice. But the novelty is that it actually pays quite a lot of attention to inequalities, suggesting that we need to pay attention to non-discrimination and how the principle is actually reflected in the way that we are collecting data. And it's child rights focused, and it means that it measures the implementation and it recognizes the indivisibility and interdependency of rights. And the process, what you see on the right-hand side, is it has to be child rights respecting, meaning the developing the indicators and using the indicators should be in itself respectful of children's rights. So I remember that the first presentation, Eilidh advised us to keep it simple. And I think I'll go in the same direction. There is a lot of complexity, but starting small might be the best solution, and then expand in incremental steps and think about the context of the work, making sure that the tools and the indicators are fit for purpose, they are clear, and driven by what needs to be known rather than by existing data. And we see a lot of tools and indexes actually developed because the data is there already. I'm not saying not to use the data, of course, where it suits, that's the first step, but let's not forget about what we need to know. So it needs to be meaningful and relevant and show us the whole picture. It has to bring the quantitative and qualitative together. And last but not least, done through a collaborative approach. And I love Lundi's reminder that it needs to include children and young people. So this was my very, very quick presentation, and I know that it only scratched the surface, but I hope that we'll have more time to discuss it in small groups. And if there are any initial questions, comments, or reflections, please let us know. Let me know. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you, Mihaela. That was absolutely fascinating, and I think it really draws together everything that we've been learning so far, because when we're thinking about child rights impact assessments, how can we know what the impact is on children and young people, and how can we know whether a policy or a decision has had that impact unless we're collecting data, unless we're talking to children and young people, having rights-based indicators on whether things have actually changed. And I think the same as well when we're talking about human rights budgeting, then how do we know where to spend money to make sure that children and young people's rights are secured unless we know what the situation is for children and young people? And again, like what Mihaela says, children's participation has to be central to that. It's not just about kind of very quantitative data, it's about speaking to children and young people and finding out about their experiences and including that in some of the indicators. So thank you so much. I think that was really timely, and yet again I'm really glad that we were filming that presentation, because there's so much there for us to get our heads around and to learn more about.